Bosnia's international peace envoy, Christian Schmidt, has given an ultimatum to the political parties. Unless the parliament adopts changes to the country's electoral law, he will pass them in the next couple of weeks. He says, quote, "I have respect for the decisions made by the parliament, and that is why I'm saying that this is my last call to the parliamentary structure to make a decision on its own. If not, I will come to the deadlines and I will consider this disrespect to the voters." Most of the parties announced they will vote in favor of the laws, but Bosnian Serb leader Milorad Dodik threatened if Schmidt imposes the changes, Republika Srpska entity will pass its own election law and have an election commission conduct the vote in the country's Serb entity. Schmidt, as a high representative, has powers to change laws and sack officials seen as obstructing Bosnia's peace deal. He was criticized for changing the election law on election night last October, which was aimed to remove blockades of the federation government formation. And what changes to the electoral law does Schmidt want to impose? Well, he says he wants laws that will strengthen Bosnia's democracy and the integrity of the electoral process, adding these are only technical changes that the parliament has been discussing to implement for years, but couldn't agree. Well, these include video surveillance to monitor polling stations during the elections, presidents of electoral boards to be appointed by Central Electoral Commission, ballots to be scanned before voters put them in the boxes. Well, there's a lot to unpack here, so I'm joined now from Sarajevo by Sabina Čudić. She's a member of the National Parliament of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Sabina, great to have you with us on Across the Balkans. Now, what are the chances that we will see these laws actually adopted by the parliament?
Practically none, because we already saw the announcements made by the leaders of, namely Dodik's party, SNSD, and HDZ, majority Croat party, that they would not be supporting these election law changes. I'm coming straight from a meeting here with the Central Election Committee, where we talk not only about these changes, but the possible technical changes that can be implemented theoretically for the upcoming local elections and more realistically for the general elections in 2026.
And why is Milorad Dodik so against these laws? And what if he does impose his own election law as he threatens?
You have to put Milorad Dodik's political decisions in a wider context that's not only tied to this issue, but is anti-state activities, very consistent anti-state activities, or any activities that have the potential to strengthen, namely the state level, but also Bosnia and Herzegovina as such. So this is just one of many in line of decisions that he's making to undermine the credibility of the national level and the credibility of Bosnia and Herzegovina when facing international community, particularly in this delicate moment when we are awaiting decision whether the accession talks will be opened with Bosnia and Herzegovina with the EU in March 2024.
Right, I'll come to that a little bit later and the possibility of opening accession talks, but I do want to ask you about these particular laws that Schmidt is trying to impose. How significant are they? We've talked about them a little bit. It seems like they are just technical changes, but what would they mean for Bosnia?
They're incredibly significant because they would increase the legitimacy of the election process that had been widely criticized and undermined by widespread election fraud throughout Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this is something that we've been pointing out as the opposition, but also from those in power, as those in power. We have noticed, and all international reports will confirm this. For example, on a small scale where the recount took place, the discrepancies between the election results reported and what the recount showed are enormous, are above all European averages. This was particularly evident, let's say, in Mostar elections, where even on a small, as I said, scale, it showed incredible election fraud. So I think it would increase the trust of Bosnia and Herzegovina's citizens in the election process, they could be comfortable in knowing that their vote counts, that their opinion matters. We already saw widespread election fraud in Republika Srpska in the last general elections, widely contested, major protests in Banja Luka between opposition and ruling SNSD. So in a sense, it would mean a lot, not just in the face of when facing international community, but for citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, having trust in the election process is paramount.
Right. We've seen what's happening in Serbia after they held snap elections. Exactly. So it's extremely significant. So it seems like, Sabina, that Schmidt will have to impose these laws by himself in the next couple of weeks. But when you look the comments coming from many politicians and analysts in Bosnia, they often say Schmidt violated democratic process before when he changed the laws back in October. Do you think this was the case? And what is your opinion about his work?
He finds himself in a rather delicate position because his legitimacy has been questioned by virtually everybody on the kind of election, political, not just elections related, but the political spectrum in general. What we usually saw is mostly undermining his legitimacy requests came from Banja Luka and Serb-led parties, but now it's, I would say, widespread. As I said, he is trying to please everyone and no one at the same time by imposing certain pieces of legislation that are there to satisfy major ethnic groups. His predecessor, as you know, imposed the legislation on forbidding denial of genocide, criminalizing denial of genocide. At the same time, certain moves have been seen as favoring other ethnicity-based political parties. However, Bosnia and Herzegovina, I do believe, doesn't have a reliable alternative to its EU path. And part of that EU path is also Office of the High Representative. Whether I'm personally happy with all of his decisions, of course not. But if I question his legitimacy to make these decisions, then I need to face the consequences of international community potential and the Office of High Representative potentially withdrawing. And this also brings into question the legitimacy of the international judges who need to remain in the national courts of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So in that sense, questioning his legitimacy is a dangerous political game because it has wider political consequences than simply the consequences of particular actions that I may like or not that he's making.
Right. A significant couple of months ahead of Bosnia's state ruling coalition as we wait to see what will happen with its EU negotiation talks. Do you think the EU has been fair towards Bosnia when it opened the negotiation talks with Ukraine and Moldova unconditionally and conditioned Bosnia once again?
I wouldn't call it a question necessarily of fairness, but I do believe that it's unclear, and rightly so, to citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, the difference between the countries that have opened their accession talks with the EU and Bosnia and Herzegovina. It's unclear how much more of a progress did they achieve compared to Bosnia and Herzegovina, particularly considering that both countries find themselves in a deeply politically difficult position, not to mention that Ukraine is obviously in the middle of the war. And I think strategically this is a wrong decision to be made on the part of the EU, because I think even to their citizens, to the citizens of the European Union countries, it is the criteria seems to be elusive, as they're moving away from necessarily fully merit-based approach to more strategic approach that takes into consideration EU security interests. It is unclear that exactly how far did they move along the line, moving from merit-based to geostrategic policy. And I think that endangers progressive forces in the EU. And as we saw in the previous days, they are fearing extreme right wing's rise in the European Parliament's elections. And I think this is all tied because we don't see a convincing narrative coming from Brussels about the future of the EU, about its security future, about its political and economic future, about its internal reforms. And I dare say that in that regard, the EU is suffering from identity crisis. And I'm only half joking when I say that these days I'm more worried about the EU than I am about Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Okay, Sabina Čudić, thanks so much for explaining all that to us. We'll keep an eye on what happens next and what is the next move by the international envoy for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and especially those possible opening of the EU negotiation talks. And I hope to have you again on the program. Thank you. Worshippers in the region celebrated Christmas, a most joyful holiday for Catholics. In the Balkans, people mostly spent it with their families and friends or went to masses. But some took it to the next level, like one man in Croatia who turned on 5 million lights in his backyard. Yasemin Čolakolu reports.
In central Croatia, a man's childhood dream has inspired him to decorate his estate with what has now amounted to 5 million light bulbs. Zlatko Salaj started what he calls Salajland in 2001, and it has been a hit ever since.
Predložio sam mojoj pokojnoj supruzi da okitim, da kupim 70.000 žaruljica i da okitim jedan dio imanja. I ona je to vrlo rado prihvatila jer znala da nisam imao Borića nikako kad sam bio dijete. I tako je onda to krenulo, onda je veliki interes bio, ljudi su se bojali u dvorište doći, nego na cesti su gledali, onda sam ja dolazio i zvao. I onda su pitali jel će biti iduću godinu više, pa je rekao ako vam se sviđa, bit će. Onda sam napravio 100.000. I tako se svaku godinu povećavalo.
The number of visitors has grown over the years, and Salaj estimates some 100,000 people from Croatia and neighboring countries come to see the annual event.
Prvi put sam ovdje, predivno je, muzika, lampice, boravak na svježem zraku, šetnja predivna. Eto, najljepše mi je recimo bilo stijene gdje je Isusov grob.
And in the country's capital Zagreb, a very successful Christmas market also attracted visitors from all over the world. Apart from the dazzling lights, visitors enjoyed traditional local dishes, along with international favorites like crabs and hot dogs. The highlight of the venue is a huge ice rink with festive decorations.
Oh, I love it. It's so beautiful. It's an experience like I've never had before. I love all the different kinds of food, and the decorations are incredible. It was so exciting the other night when they lit everything up.
In neighboring Slovenia, the Christmas season started with heavy snowfall. People gathered in the capital Ljubljana to admire the decorations. To cap off the festivities, actors and musicians performed the nativity story in an unusual setting southwest of the country. This traditional performance has been going on since 1989.
Jatko je to predstavo živih jaslica na 5 kilometrih podzemlja Postojnske jame igra 100 domačinov, neprofesionalnih igralcev, ampak ko jih vidimo, zgleda to vse zelo profesionalno.
Further south, all the way in Greece, hundreds of Athenians and tourists gathered in front of the Athens City Hall to write their Christmas wishes on paper lanterns and release them into the sky. Some wished for good health, others for happiness, but one wish which Galina from Ukraine had was on most people's minds.
Peace. Peace and friendship. And good health. For all people. For all good people.
From dazzling displays across countries to shared moments of celebration, here's hoping for better times and much more peace in the new year. Yasemin Čolakolu, across the Balkans.
And happy holidays from all of us here in Istanbul. Thanks for watching this episode of Across the Balkans. See you next time, and bye-bye for now.